alone during the 2023 Eid al-Adha, a practice that generated an estimated $2 billion in economic activity. Yet, while these figures suggest a massive religious and commercial engine, they also mask a deep-seated tension between ancient tradition and modern rationalism. When a ritual shifts from a symbolic act to an unshakable social mandate, it often becomes a wall that blocks scientific progress and social reform. We are looking at the heavy cost of following customs blindly, specifically those rooted in misconceptions that can end up devastating lives on a massive scale.
It is a phenomenon where ignorance or la-ilmi feeds into a cycle of self-perpetuating rituals. These aren't just harmless quirks of culture. They are often rigid structures that people cling to with a conviction that borders on the absolute. In many societies, once a practice is labeled as tradition or riti rivaj, it gains a form of immunity. If that practice then gets the backing of religious authorities or clerics, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge without being branded as a heretic or an outsider. We see this play out in how societies handle everything from public health to legal rights.
The example of animal sacrifice during Hajj is a particularly sharp point of contention. The primary ritual is centered in Makkah, but it has expanded into a global event where Muslims everywhere perform the sacrifice in their own locales. There is a logical disconnect there that some scholars, like the Pakistani theologian Ghulam Ahmed Pervez, have pointed out. If the core of the ritual is tied to the pilgrimage in Makkah, why has the secondary act of slaughtering animals become a mandatory, decentralized global requirement that places such a massive financial burden on individual families every single year?
Pervez's argument was that the sacrifice is an integral part of the Hajj ceremony itself, meant for those present in Makkah to feed the pilgrims and the local poor. By making it a global requirement, it has been transformed into a massive industry. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, for instance, the leather industry depends on these hides for roughly 37 to 60% of its annual raw material. When a ritual becomes the backbone of a multi-billion-dollar economy, the stakeholders, the traders, the tanners, and even the religious institutions that collect the hides have a vested interest in keeping the status quo. They won't let a rationalist interpretation of the text interfere with a profitable tradition.
That economic entanglement makes it even harder for a reformer to step in. You aren't just fighting a belief, you're fighting a supply chain. But what happens when the tradition isn't just an economic burden, but is actually life-threatening? Look at the history of sati in India, the practice of a widow immolating herself on her husband's funeral pyre. It was legally banned by the British in 1829 under Lord William Bentinck, largely thanks to the tireless campaigning of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. But despite the law, the practice didn't just vanish overnight. It lingered in the shadows for over a century.
The sati case is the perfect example of how religious freedom can be used as a shield for horrific violence. Even after the 1829 ban, and even after modern laws like the Sati Prevention Act of 1987 in India, which followed the public immolation of Rup Kanwar, there are still segments of society that glorify the act. They view it as the ultimate proof of a woman's devotion. When the state tries to intervene, religious hardliners often frame it as an attack on their culture or a Western conspiracy. It shows that even undeniable evidence of harm isn't always enough to break the grip of a deeply held superstition.
It is not just about physical rituals, though. It is also about the psychological frameworks people use to justify their suffering. There is this recurring idea in many cultures that a great leader or an avatar can take on the suffering of the masses. In Christian theology, the concept of vicarious atonement, the idea that Jesus died to pay for the sins of humanity, is the central pillar. But when this theological concept is exported into politics, it creates a dangerous messiah complex among followers.
Exactly. The political application of vicarious suffering leads to a total abdication of personal responsibility. If you believe your leader is a divinely appointed figure who is suffering for you, then you are more likely to ignore their flaws, their corruption, or their failures. We see this in the cults of personality surrounding figures like Altaf Hussain or Imran Khan in Pakistan. Their followers often view any legal challenge or criticism of these leaders as a form of persecution against a holy figure. It turns politics into a battle of faiths rather than a debate on policy or governance.
And that faith is often weaponized against the state's ability to legislate. The most frustrating part is when religious groups use their influence to block laws that are clearly meant to protect the vulnerable. Recently, the Council of Islamic Ideology in Pakistan rejected a bill that sought to raise the minimum marriage age to 18, calling it un-Islamic. They argued that Islam does not fix a specific age for marriage, but focuses on maturity. This effectively leaves the door open for child marriages, which we know have devastating health and social consequences for young girls.
The resistance to using DNA evidence in rape cases is another staggering example. For years, there was pushback against making DNA a primary form of evidence, with some clerics insisting on the traditional requirement of 4 eyewitnesses. It is a refusal to accept the unbreakable scientific discovery you mentioned earlier. When you prioritize a medieval interpretation of evidence over a 99% accurate genetic test, you are essentially choosing to protect the perpetrator over the victim, all in the name of preserving a specific tradition.
It feels like a deliberate choice to stay in the dark. But why? Is it just ignorance, or is there a more calculated motive? It seems like there is a symbiotic relationship between corrupt political leaders and religious gatekeepers. The leaders get a compliant, superstitious voter base that is easy to manipulate, and the clerics get to maintain their social authority and financial perks. They use the freedom of religion argument to ensure that no one questions the rituals that keep them in power.
That's the core of the problem. Democratic principles are supposed to be built on rational thought and the protection of individual rights. But when a majority's right to practice their religion involves the systematic harm of women, children, or the poor, then we have to ask where the limit is. Is a society truly free if it allows people to remain enslaved to superstitions that destroy their lives? You can't have a functioning democracy if the majority of the electorate is making decisions based on omens and the decrees of self-appointed saints rather than facts and reason.
It is a paradox. We value freedom of expression and belief, but those very freedoms are being used to shut down the education and scientific inquiry that would eventually liberate people from these harmful cycles. We've seen this in Morocco recently, where the king actually stepped in to tell people to abstain from the Eid sacrifice this year because of a massive agricultural crisis and rising prices. It was a rare moment where a religious authority used their power to prioritize the socio-economic reality over the literal performance of a ritual.
That's a fascinating counterexample. King Mohammed VI, as commander of the faithful, essentially gave his people permission to be rational. It shows that change often has to come from the top when the social pressure to conform is too high. Without that royal cover, many families would have gone into debt just to buy a sheep to avoid the social stigma of not sacrificing. It proves that the tradition is often more about social performance and peer pressure than it is about personal faith.
So, if the change doesn't come from a top-down authority like a king or a revolutionary reformer, how does it happen? Can science alone do it? We have the DNA tests, we have the medical data on child marriage, and we have the economic analysis of ritualistic waste. Yet the clutch of the cleric remains strong. It seems like a battle between two different versions of reality.
It really is. One reality is based on empirical evidence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The other is based on the preservation of identity through the repetition of ancestral acts. The only way to bridge that gap is through a long-term commitment to rational education.
We have to move away from an education system that rewards rote memorization of traditional texts and instead foster a culture of critical questioning. People need to feel that it's okay to ask why a certain custom exists and who actually benefits from it.
That brings us back to the pushback. Every time a government tries to update the curriculum or pass a progressive law, they face dangsota, the threat of physical violence or armed protest. It is hard for a democratic government to stay rational when it's being held hostage by a mob that thinks it's doing God's work. The fear of social chaos, or anarchy, as Maulana Jalaluddin warned in Pakistan, is a very effective tool for stopping reform.
That fear is exactly what the corrupt leaders rely on. They point to the potential for unrest as a reason to avoid making necessary changes. But we have to look at the slow-motion anarchy that is already happening. The thousands of girls whose health is ruined by early pregnancy. The innocent people trapped in legal systems that reject forensic science. And the millions of families living in poverty while pouring their limited resources into ritualistic displays. That is a form of social destruction that is just as real as a street protest, but it's quieter and more sustained.
It is the invisible tax of ignorance. And it's not just a problem in the global south. We see versions of this everywhere. The rejection of vaccines based on conspiracy theories, the denial of climate science for political gain. The specific rituals might change, but the underlying mechanism of la ilmi is the same. It is the elevation of how we've always done it over what we now know to be true.
That's why this isn't just a religious debate. It's a fundamental question of human progress. If we can't question our traditions, we can't evolve. The avatar leaders and the clerics who protect them are essentially trying to freeze time. They want to keep society in a state where their specific brand of authority remains unquestioned. Breaking that freeze requires a massive amount of courage from individuals within those communities to stand up and say, this does not make sense anymore.
And that courage is often met with extreme hostility. But as history shows, with the abolition of sati or the gradual acceptance of medical science in the face of plague, the truth does eventually win out. It just takes a heartbreakingly long time and a lot of unnecessary suffering. We have to move toward a society where the right to believe doesn't override the right to be safe and the right to know the facts.
Ultimately, the goal isn't to destroy culture, but to refine it. A culture that can't let go of its harmful parts is a culture that is eventually going to collapse under its own weight. We need rituals that build community and provide meaning without demanding a blood sacrifice, whether that's an animal, a woman's autonomy, or our collective sanity. Rationality isn't the enemy of faith, it's the filter that keeps faith from becoming a weapon of destruction.
It is about moving from a state of blind adherence to one of informed choice. When we look at the examples of child marriage laws or the globalized nature of sacrifice, we are seeing the friction points of a world trying to modernize. The question remains, will we listen to the reformers and the scientists, or will we continue to let the gatekeepers of tradition dictate the terms of our existence at the cost of our most vulnerable citizens?
The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. Whether it's the health data on early marriage or the economic studies on ritual waste, the rational case is airtight. The challenge now is to build the political and social will to act on that evidence, even when it means standing up to the loudest voices in the room. Progress isn't a straight line, but it is a necessary one.
We've explored how deeply rooted misconceptions and rituals can create a cycle of socio-economic and human suffering. From the globalized ritual of sacrifice to the systemic resistance against child protection laws, the conflict between tradition and reason defines the struggles of many modern societies.
It is a reminder that the cost of ignorance is paid in human lives, and the path to liberation starts with the courage to question the riti rivaj that no longer serves us. Please share this episode with someone who enjoys exploring the complex intersection of culture, religion, and reform.